How would you look back at India in 2023? I feel personally that it's been a big year for them.
The lunar landing was a really big deal. It's the only country to have had a soft landing on the South Pole.
What do you think that the situation does do for the cohesion and stability of US-Indo relations?
The strategic imperative here from a US perspective, they're really unassailable, really needs a partner in South Asia to help it counter China. India supports the idea of anything that's not bipolar. It supports the idea of multiple power centers can navigate relations with different countries.
This is The Global Gambit. 2023 has been a big year for India, and it's been a big year for American-Indian relations, interests, engagement, be it from having to navigate a challenging situation around supposed assassination attempts, extraterritorial assassination attempts in Canada, potentially in the United States, to trying to find workarounds when it comes to climate change, and of course now the Israel-Palestinian situation and the impact of that on India's new Silk Road efforts. Joining me to talk about that is Michael Kugelman, who is part of the Wilson Center and an expert on many things South Asia. Michael, I guess my first question for you about the Indian situation is, how would you look back at India in 2023? I feel personally that it's been a big year for them. They've really come into their own under Modi. We've got some elections next year, but it looks like, India's running quite high at the moment, flying quite high. And they will be I guess I put it this way, there's illustrations that they're growing in confidence geopolitically and on the international stage vis-a-vis their foreign policy because of things that we'll come to in a minute. But what's your take on the Indian geopolitical sense after this year?
Yeah, it was definitely a big year for India, particularly geopolitically. And I think that given that India has really become a significant global power, in my view, every year is going to be a big year geopolitically. And yeah, this year was no exception. India came into this year amid predictions that it was going to supplant China as the most populous country in the world, which it did, I believe. And its economy became, I believe, the fifth fastest growing economy, the fifth largest economy in the world. And it has one of the fastest growing economies in the world. So there's that as the backdrop. But yeah, I think that what really stands out about this year for India geopolitically is that it held the G20 presidency, which is, just part of the rotating system within the G20. It was India's turn to play that role, but it's something that India really made a big deal out of, and it made it a big part of its broader foreign policy. I'd argue it made it a big part of its domestic politics as well. And, the idea here was for India to show just how significant a global player it can be in its own unique way by, for example, serving as a bridge between the rich countries and the global South. And indeed, during its year as G20 chief, it made a lot of efforts to get the G20 countries to focus on addressing the biggest economic challenges that disproportionately impact the poorest countries in the world. It also was successful in bringing in a key global South entity as a new member of the G20, that being the African Union. So I think that the G20 presidency was really significant. It helped Modi, it helped the Indian government project itself to the world as a significant global player. And then there were other successes too. I mean, the lunar landing was a really big deal. As you know, India became part of a very small club of countries that have successfully had soft landings on the moon, and I believe it's the only country to have had a soft landing on the South Pole of the moon. So this was something that, obviously showcased India's scientific and technological prowess. That's a really big deal as well. Again, it was politicized by the government, but one would expect that. Yeah, so it was a really big year, but I think there are some interesting questions raised about next year, which we could talk about. But, very briefly, we've seen, as I think I had mentioned earlier, India faced some really serious allegations from key Western partners, Canada and the US, that it was attempting, in one case successfully, in the other unsuccessfully, extrajudicial killings. And, that is something that I think will pose a bit of a diplomatic challenge for India going into next year, even though on the whole, the international community, particularly the West, has been willing to overlook some of these repressive policies and tactics. But these are pretty serious charges, as you know. So that I think has put a bit of a damper on this big geopolitical year for India. And the other point I'll make is that India will no longer be the G20 chief. In fact, it already turned over the G20 presidency to Brazil a few weeks ago. So it's not going to be able to leverage that anymore. And I think a big question is, will it continue to focus on those same priorities that it was carrying out with the assistance of the G20 chairship? So this idea of serving as a bridge and a leader, a bridge between the developed world and the developing world, a voice of the global South. It really wants to do that. But will it be able to do that as easily if it doesn't enjoy that very prominent perch atop the G20?
No, 100%. I want to come back to sort of there was a very good article, an interview that Modi had with the Financial Times at the time of recording this morning. He touched upon the extraterritorial assassinations, which I want to focus on right now. But he did talk about the role of multilateralism and sort of, I think, implicit references to China, and definitely more explicit indication that America is the way that India wants to go. Not, allies to that extent, but definitely want to align more with the US than, say, China. But you wrote a very interesting article a couple months back about the situation between the assassinations, and we've had some good conversations about it on the channel as well. People, you can find it on your screen now. What do you think that the situation does do for the cohesion and stability of US-Indo relations, specifically because the point I make in the other conversation with a friend of mine is that America's not going to risk its geopolitical long-term strategical interests over the specific, questionable and human rights actions of India in the case of Canada, right? Canada is a Five Eyes member, but I still feel that the Americans may try to sort of deal with this situation softly, tacitly, covertly, instead of making a public dilemma out of it, because otherwise that will alienate China and undermine American interests. Do you disagree with that sentiment?
I do agree with you. The U.S.-India relationship will be fine, though it is impacted in ways that it has not been for quite some time. And I think that this is a relationship that's been spoiled on many levels because over the last few years, yeah, there have been some bumps here and there, but there hasn't really been a significant crisis. I think you'd have to go back exactly a decade, in fact. In late 2013, there was a pretty significant crisis between the U.S. and India when a senior Indian consular official in New York City was arrested, treated poorly in detention, and it caused all kinds of problems for the relationship. There really hasn't been many crises since then. But so this is significant, and I think that the biggest reason why the relationship is impacted in a negative way, and then I'll get into why it's ultimately going to be okay, is that we're talking about unprecedented developments here. We're talking about uncharted territory. Has there ever been a case where a U.S. government has accused a close partner of being complicit in an extrajudicial killing on U.S. soil? This is very unusual, and I'm not sure if this has ever happened. And I think that for those U.S. officials that for so long have been so enthused and focused, passionate about moving this very important relationship forward, I think it's a shock to the system to know that India has, or if the indictment is true, that India has indeed, that an Indian government official orchestrated an extrajudicial killing on U.S. soil. It's a big shock to the system. And, there's a lot of trust in the relationship, a whole lot of trust. But if you look at how the relationship has progressed, because of that trust, you're seeing a lot more technology transfers, a lot more intelligence sharing than you ever have before, I think. And that entails a lot of trust. So I think that for those U.S. officials involved in those policies, I think there's going to be a bit of a sort of a little bit of anxiety thinking about, gee, we're doing this with a country that may well have done this to us. So that's why I think the relationship will be impacted. But ultimately, I think that the relationship will sail through very briefly three reasons why. One is just the nature of the relationship itself. It's hardwired to withstand shocks. For about 2 decades, the relationship has experienced exponential growth. You have deep levels of cooperation across so many different areas. Very importantly, you have regular high-level dialogues that take place, and that allows the two sides to discuss issues they don't agree on, and that helps build trust as well. So it's hardwired to withstand shocks, and it survived that crisis I mentioned, about a decade ago, known as the Cobra affair. Second reason why the relationship will be okay is what you had alluded to before. The strategic imperatives are very strong, and I would argue from a U.S. perspective, they're really unassailable. That the U.S. has concluded that it really needs a partner in South Asia to help it counter China. And India is the most logical choice by far, not just because of its location, its size, its strength, its economy, and so on, but also that, unlike any other country in South Asia, it has its own longstanding competition with China. And there has been some debate in Washington in recent months that since India is not an ally, since it refuses to participate in the alliance system, it's not a worthwhile partner. But one could push back and say, well, look, India has showed that it's actually can be a net security provider in the Indo-Pacific. It's about to ship a supply of BrahMos missiles to the Philippines. This has not been in the news that much, but that's pretty significant. And also, I think in Washington, there's a view that India can push back against China through non-military means, such as potentially with its booming tech sector. So I think that the strategic imperatives for partnership are so strong that no one in Washington, or very few officials in Washington, would want to let the serious allegations get in the way of that. Final point, why the relationship will survive, and this is the more provocative one, but I think it's important to mention, despite what you may hear in U.S. public messaging, it does not let considerations about values and morals and democracy and so on shape its choices of strategic partners, right? It's for so long it's had many strategic partners that are not democracies, that are repressive, right? You go back to the Cold War when you had these brutal right-wing brutal right-wing dictatorships that were anti-communist. They partnered with the U.S. And then if you look at countries today, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, I would argue Israel as well. These are close partners of the U.S., strategic partners. They're not known for not being repressive or brutal. But at the end of the day, the U.S. makes its decisions about strategic partners through matters of interest. No surprise to anyone, but I think it's worth mentioning. So yeah, bottom line is I think that the relationship will be okay. It has been scarred, and those trust factors I mentioned will be are significant and real, particularly when it comes to how individual U.S. officials perceive the relationship with India. But on the whole, the relationship will be all right.
Yeah, I largely agree. I think that the relationship is I won't say simple to understand, but like for me, it's a case of you're seeing India being. It has never been. The Americans have tried to pull India closer for years, for decades, and it's never really worked. Strategical autonomy is something the Indians are very proud of and prioritize and do very well. But there is shifts because of the push factors, namely, I think, the Chinese belligerency and the wolf warrior diplomacy. Although we've had people on from different locations, we had Ken Moriyasu, the one of the diplomatic correspondents for the Nikkei Asia publication, and he was saying about there is a sentiment in Tokyo, at least, that there's a shift in Chinese foreign policy when it comes to how President Xi is seeking to manage things, and you've alluded to it there, the overtaking of the most populous country, the slowdown in Chinese outputs, the unwillingness to publish youth employment data and just generally economic metrics of the Chinese. So I was just wondering, what do you see the Indian-Sino relations looking like right now? Pretty bad, non-existent, as bad as they could get. Just in the context of the West, I know you're not speaking for the Chinese, but as a Western analyst looking at the two and how their dynamics are playing out.
Well, the main baseline point of analysis is that the relationship between India and China changed in a big way in 2020 when they had this deadly border clash in Ladakh, which was the deadliest clash between the two countries since they went to war in 1962. And there's been regular dialogue between the two militaries to try to address this ongoing border crisis and the fact that China, in India's view, continues to be a threat, staging provocations, and so on. So there's that, but it certainly is in a very difficult spot, and I think that it's gotten to the point where India now views China, not Pakistan, as its biggest strategic concern, as its biggest strategic threat. Believes that it can manage any security risks emanating from Pakistan, which in India's view revolve around state-sponsored terrorism in Pakistan. But with China, it's very different. It views a country that is openly provoking it on the border, and this is something that India has been unable to deter, and Indian officials would not acknowledge this publicly. But let's face it, there's good evidence, including satellite data, indicating that Chinese army forces continue to, in some cases, be hunkered down on territory that India regards as its own, a remnant of that 2020 clash. So this is a big concern for India, but it's not only the border issue. India worries about China's increasing naval power. It really worries about how China has been able to develop, has been able to project naval power in a big way in the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean region. The only known Chinese overseas military base is off Djibouti, which is not too far from India at the end of the day. India also believes that China has had spy vessels circulating around the Andaman Sea, which is, of course, near Indian island territories. So for all kinds of reasons, India is very concerned about China's power and its power projection, which it regards as very dangerous and threatening for its interests. Yes, India's tensions with China have certainly helped advance U.S.-India partnership. But one thing that it has not done is prompt India to be compelled to seek a formal alliance with the United States. That is not going to change. And you go back to that Ladakh clash in 2020. Right after that broke out, you had India's external affairs minister, Jaishankar, say that we will never join the alliance system. Not we're not going to, we will never join it, which I think is an indication of how China feels on these issues. We have seen, though, this U.S.-India partnership, it is helping India to a significant extent. We now know that about a year ago, I believe, there was an attempt by the Chinese to stage a provocation, an incursion onto territory that India believes to be its own, and the U.S. supplied intelligence to India that helps India preempt that. So that's a nice example of how U.S.-India partnership can help India fend off China, which of course serves the interests of both Washington and New Delhi.
So I've got a couple more questions for you, Michael. The second to last one is about some other comments that Modi mentioned in the interview with the Financial Times at the time of recording, which was about this emphasis of multilateralism. We've seen, I think, 2023, a real peak of Indian multilateralism there. And just wondering what you feel that means for India going into the short to medium term. And I'll use one specific example, which is the ongoing maritime insecurities in the Gulf of Aden with the Houthis. There is the I2U2, of which obviously India is a big component of it, sort of the Western version of the Quad, as people seem to try to call it. What do you think about India in this regard? I mean, not specifically just Israel-Palestine, but if you want to touch upon that, I'm curious, but also just India and the multilateralism.
Right. So these multi-terms are important for India. Multilateralism, multipolarity, and I should say minilateralism as well, which is becoming a big deal. And India supports the idea of anything that's not bipolar. It supports the idea of multiple power centers, which I think plays to its own desire to be a non-aligned state, where it can navigate relations with different countries and not feel pressured by a powerful small group of countries to align with them. So it supports multipolarity, and one could argue that this might be something that would be detrimental to U.S. interests. Some could suggest that, does this mean India wants to see less U.S. power? Not necessarily, but it's an interesting point. So, it's an interesting case, and yes, India is a big fan of so many different of these multilateral groupings, and we've seen that it's been willing to participate in quite a few of them that are, in many cases, not particularly fond of the West. And I think, again, that reflects India's non-aligned strategy. Been a lot of talk about the BRICS over the last year, right? As you know, the BRICS has expanded. It's a group that's historically been dominated by China and Russia. And of course, South Africa came in most recently. Then India and Brazil are a part of it too. It's expanding. And I think that this has raised concerns that India is a part of a grouping that is anti-West, and you have Iran joining, which could make it even more anti-West. I don't necessarily think that's true. I don't necessarily think India sees that way, or definitely doesn't see it that way. India is keen to participate in a variety of multilateral groupings that could enable it to, project influence, give it a seat at the table, so to speak, in these prestigious forums. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is another good example. It's another grouping that's dominated historically by China and to a lesser extent Russia. India joined it along with Pakistan some years back. Again, it's seen as an entity that's meant to serve as an alternative to U.S.-led, West-led arrangements, institutions, particularly in terms of economic institutions in around the world. India is very comfortable in these forums because at the end of the day, it's about pursuing its interests, projecting influence, and it wants to do that in the company of both its Western friends and its non-Western friends. But it prefers to be involved in those multilateral fora that are not hardcore security institutions. Of course, the Quad, the Indo-Pacific Quad, not I2U2, but the Indo-Pacific Quad is a security grouping, but it's not something that operates as an alliance. That's not the case at all. And in fact, the main focus of the Indo-Pacific Quad, and I would argue of I2U2 as it evolves, is to have countries partnering together commercially and perhaps working together to produce and distribute important public goods, whether you're talking about clean energy technologies, COVID vaccines, whatever the case may be. So, yeah, India's interests are served by a more multilateral world and certainly by a more multipolar world. I would argue that it's getting what it wants on multipolarity, but not multilateralism because of how sharp great power competition is across the board. I think that's really militated against the emergence of more multilateralism and on the whole, more global cooperation.
I'm 100% with you on the notion of India not being in the same bucket as China and Russia when it comes to their usage of the BRICS. India wants to be able to participate in whatever it wants. That's what the idea of strategical autonomy is. And they want to be able, and they know that they can get away with that. I think because they are so, I don't know, wanted by so many people, if you know what I mean. It's a very interesting thing to watch play out if you're a particular sort of IR nerd like myself. Say, there was one conversation we had with Ali Wayne of Eurasia Group about this, and he was emphasizing to me that, China and Russia may well be the two biggest proponents, but it's India and China that will be seen as the de facto leaders of it because they're the largest, even if, but that's the problem. BRICS is not unified because China, India, and now you've got Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the bigger it gets, the more cumbersome and ineffective it becomes. Much like people can whinge about the UN. So it's sort of like, well, is it going to be as effective as you think it is in the long run? Not saying that the West doesn't have its problems. Well, the last question I have for you, Michael, is you wrote an article relatively recently about the wins of the BJP. And what this is doing for the opposition. Obviously, we do have the Congress Party, which is trying to gather momentum still. But as you write in your article, the momentum is seemingly switching towards that of the BJP in the run up to the big elections. So just wondering if you could break down a little bit how you see the domestic situation in India as we run up to the elections next year.
Well, there's, as I think I mentioned at the top, there are 5 elections in South Asia next year. And I think the one in India has the least amount of intrigue to it, in the sense that it seems quite clear to me that the BJP will win, return for a third straight term under Modi. And the opposition, the Congress and other elements of the opposition had enjoyed a fair amount of momentum until relatively recently. The Congress Party won a key election in Karnataka, southern state in India, some months ago. And then there was an announcement of a new alliance among several dozen Indian opposition parties. And that's a big deal because the opposition in India has been notoriously fractured in recent years, dominated by the Congress Party. There are others, but there have been a number of challenges in uniting. So there's a new opposition alliance that went by the acronym of India, which is very symbolic for sure. Also, we had this year Rahul Gandhi, who had been saddled with all kinds of legal charges that he and his supporters believe to be politically manufactured. Which, if it sounds familiar, it should, because this is what opposition leaders in Bangladesh and Pakistan have been dealing with as well. He received his jail sentence was basically dropped, which essentially meant that he could be back participating in politics, running for office, and so on. But then, yeah, those 3 state elections won by the BJP were critical. Only one of those states did the BJP hold power before the elections happened. So really significant, delivered a big blow to the Congress Party in particular, and I would argue, perhaps more importantly, delivered a blow to that India opposition alliance, just because the Congress Party had chosen to wage those election campaigns in those 3 states by itself. It didn't really want to work with other parties in the India alliance, and I think that did not go down well with other members of the alliance. And I think that there's questions as to whether the alliance itself could be impacted deleteriously thanks to the outcome of those 3 elections, those BJP victories, and the fact that Congress didn't appear willing to work in an alliance-like context with those other parties. But Modi remains very popular. His party remains very popular. I don't think there's enough time for the trend to be reversed. India goes to the polls in April. The elections start in April. They'll run through May. That's just a few months. And I think that barring something incredibly unforeseen, some type of black swan that neither you or I could even think of, I think that we'll see the BJP back and Modi back too.
I agree. I think that the situation with Modi is sort of similar to a little bit to Bangladesh in the sense of we've had a sustained set of people, sustained party in power for a very extended period of time, and that's going to play out quite significantly, I think. Although I did have a very interesting conversation with a gentleman called Gautam Desaraju, whose actually interview I've put in the nest above, along with Michael's article about the importance of Bharat as a name, Bharat, and also the sort of the way that many Indians look at the Congress Party and it's sort of its overly perhaps Western influences. So I think it's going to be a fascinating development in the next 3 to 4 months. But Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us. Everyone, if you haven't already, do check out part 1, part 2, part 1 being about Bangladesh, part 2 being about Pakistan. They'll be on your screen around now, and I look forward to seeing you in a future episode.